Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Wendorf, the Stanford Calderwood Director and Librarian of the Boston Athenaeum. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening. This is, in fact, the 9th year in which the Athenaeum has collaborated on a lecture jointly sponsored by the Partnership, which is, as I think you know, an organization that is committed to the recruitment and retention of executives of color in the Boston area. This has been one of the, I think, strongest and most productive collaborations that the Athenaeum has had, and we relish looking forward to our annual event together. And as I looked back at the list of speakers who have spoken here or at the Boston Public Library on our common behalf, I must say it's a very distinguished list indeed. Let me just take a moment to list the names. Many of you have been here for some of these earlier lectures. The series began in 1995 with David Levering Lewis. Next year, it was Judge Leon Higginbotham. The year after, it was John Hope Franklin. That was my first Partnership lecture. Then it was Christopher Edley from Harvard's Law School, followed by his colleague Lanny Guinier the next year. In 2001, it was Isaiah Jackson, whom I'm happy to say is now a trustee of the Boston Athenaeum. 2 years ago, it was T.J. Anderson, a night of music and lecture. And last year, it was Edmund Barry Gaither. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the president of the Partnership, Benny Wiley, who's going to introduce an equally distinguished speaker this evening. Benny.
Thank you, Richard. This has been a wonderful collaboration. We've really enjoyed working with the Boston Athenaeum. Those of you who've been here in years past know that one of the reasons the Partnership enjoys this collaboration so much is we think it's a wonderful opportunity to share with the literally hundreds of professionals of color that make up the Partnership what we think is one of the jewels in the city of Boston. Ted Landsmark and I were talking before this evening's event and said it's a gem of gems, and we hope that the members of the Partnership that are here will take the opportunity to learn more about the Athenaeum, because it really is a jewel right here in the heart of downtown Boston. Richard has shared with you the distinguished list of speakers that we've had in years past, and this year is no exception. We have Ted Landsmark, who's going to speak to us on the issue of race and place. Ted came to Boston about 30 years ago, having graduated from Yale Law School, where he also earned a degree in environmental design. He is currently the president of the Boston Architectural Center, which is the largest architectural school in New England. He has held special appointments, including serving with Mayor Flynn, I believe, serving with Mayor Menino, and those of you who may have read the Globe in January know that he's been leading a special task force for Menino on a student assignment. He is a practicing attorney, particularly in architectural law. He is an avid lover of the arts. We first really worked together because we were on an art board together, and he continues to be very, very involved and active in the art community. He's a trustee at the Museum of Fine Arts, and he's actually the chair of the Board of Overseers at the Museum of Fine Arts, which we think is wonderful for the museum and equally wonderful for the city of Boston. I think most importantly, Ted Landsmark is just a fine human being, and it's my pleasure to introduce him to you this evening.
Well, thank you all for coming out on a rainy, I understand now, very rainy election night. I hope that you've all voted, but if you haven't, I'll see to it that we're out of here in time for everyone to get to the polling place to hopefully vote for our neighbor from not far from here. Hopefully it won't be your last chance to vote for him. Let me make one or two quick comments about what it is that I want to talk about tonight, and then we'll plunge into it. You should know that when I accepted the invitation to speak to you, I thought I was going to be speaking essentially about things, objects, stuff. I am a collector of folk art, primarily, and African American art. I don't necessarily view myself as a connoisseur by any stretch of the imagination, in part because the connoisseurship of folk art is in a somewhat different place than the connoisseurship of traditionally defined fine arts. And I knew that I would come in with stuff, and we would talk about things. And we will talk a little bit about things, but it also struck me that if I didn't address some of the other issues that I'm now dealing with, particularly in relation to what's going on in Boston, how Boston has changed, and how the work that I've had the privilege of doing over the last couple of months with Mayor Menino to assess the current status and to potentially recommend some changes in the current school assignment plan in Boston. I knew that if I didn't talk about that, a lot of people would leave saying, well, why didn't you talk about that? And it is also very much the case that that is a very dynamic process. And I was given by our staff in that process some data only last night at about this hour that I thought was worth sharing with this group. It is still largely confidential, but I thought it would be a lot more fun to find a way of integrating that into our conversation tonight. So we'll talk about that too, and we'll talk about stuff because I have brought stuff with me. Stuff is, for me, a portal into some of the larger issues that I think we can talk about tonight. I have a question. How many of you have described Boston as Bean Town? Can I see a show of hands? Right, but relatively few. Okay. And yet, if we pick up national media, Boston is described as Beantown by all kinds of writers and reporters, most of whom are not from here. It's an appellation, a descriptor of the city that doesn't, to a large extent, seem to describe what the city is or has become these days. So there's an external perception of this place that's driven by a term that goes back to at least when I was a kid. I remember coming up to Boston and Cambridge from New York in the early 50s, when in fact my godmother did used to serve me baked beans. But one would be hard-pressed to visit anyone's home these days and to be served baked beans. And so the term Beantown really doesn't mean very much to us anymore as a real descriptor of what Boston is. But let me ask you, what do you think of when you think of Boston? And I'm not asking that rhetorically. We're going to take a minute or two to answer that. Sir? Ooh, that's a good one. We'll come back to that. Yes? The Zachem Bridge. A wonderful example. Yes? Hospitals. Yes? Anyone else? Yes? History. Boston and its history. Anyone else? Yes? The Athens of the West, or as it was once known, the Athens of America. What are the things that we think of as being best about Boston? What do we love about Boston? Universities. What else? Yes, sir? Walking. Right, it's a very walkable city. Yes? Baseball. Lose or lose, we love our Sox. Definitely baseball. Anyone else? Yes? The scale of the city, which also ties in very much to the perception that this is a walking city. Anything else? Yes? Well, the Athenaeum, which is fabulous. Yes? The Emerald Necklace, yes. The physical space of being able to be there, walk through it, to enjoy the Rose Garden, yes. Yeah. There's something interesting that has happened in Boston over the years, and it's something that I think is well represented in this room. The branding of Boston, that thing that we think of when we think of Boston outside of it, has changed in a number of respects. There was a time within the lifetimes of, I think, most of us in this room, there was a time when Boston was thought of as a somewhat gritty industrial kind of town. Scully Square, this is all pre-government center days. There was a kind of grit. When people made movies about Boston, you were as likely to make a movie about the waterfront and those kinds of things. And yet the city has gone through something of a transformation over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. It has certainly changed dramatically in the 30 years that I've been here. And a number of the things that have changed have also changed the very nature of the brand of the city. There was a time, for example, when First National Bank of Boston was associated with Boston. That's gone. There was a time when Shawmut Bank was associated with Boston. That's gone. There was a time when Wang as a corporation or digital were associated with Boston, and those are gone. There was a time when the New England Telephone Company and the fact that Alexander Graham Bell was located here was associated with Boston. That's gone. Most of our corporate leadership, the guys who used to be in the vault, that's all gone as an institution. The kind of corporate life that to a large extent was associated with Boston and its leadership has to a large extent disappeared and been replaced with, well, it's not yet clear what. The Zakim Bridge, as a matter of fact, has become a symbol of Boston in the 21st century, and yet most of us have barely come to become familiar with it. It's a new symbol. It is something that represents Boston perhaps in the 21st century, but in fact, most of us haven't even experienced the Zakim Bridge. My guess is that there are a number of people in this room who've looked at it, marveled at it, loved the lighting of it, but still haven't driven across it or walked underneath it. So it's a symbol which has come into being within the city that doesn't yet have visceral meaning for us. And if in fact, it hadn't been named for Lenny Zakim, who was a hero for many of us, we would view it as a beautiful bridge, but we wouldn't necessarily associate it with anything. At this moment, it is still in some respects a fabricated iconographic symbol of what Boston hopes to be, but it's not yet something that all of us have yet experienced. It's not like Franklin Park. It's not like the Public Garden. It's not like the Green Line. It is something new. And the fact that it's new is not necessarily bad in and of itself. It just means that it hasn't yet become rooted. So corporate headquarters are gone, and high tech as a major identifier is gone. And many of you answered in exactly the way I suspected you would. It's the way many of us do answer when we think about what Boston is today, and that is to say, you referenced our universities and you referenced our hospitals. Nonprofit institutions, well-rooted in the community, highly unlikely to pick up and leave and move away anytime soon, not likely to move their client base to New York or to Springfield or to Canada, not likely to outsource most of the tasks that they perform, not likely to send most of their staff abroad, not likely to close anytime soon, not likely to lay anyone off. They're nonprofit institutions, but what's also interesting about these nonprofit institutions is that I would have to submit that for many of us, to a very large extent, after Harvard and perhaps BC, after the Museum of Fine Arts, after the Boston Architectural Center, most of us, in fact, couldn't name the people who are in charge of most of those organizations. They are leaders as institutions within our communities, but they're not necessarily leaders where we look to the heads of those organizations to be civic leaders in the community. We know who they are. We expect the institutions to be civic leaders, but to a very large extent, there's something of a disconnect between what we identify as key to Boston's identity and the leadership of those organizations and the way we look to the leadership of those organizations as individuals, as leaders who will set the agenda for the coming century. Boston's now the 20th largest city in America, if you're just looking at cities. It's sometimes a little embarrassing to see which cities are about our size or bigger. It's surprising to find out that Memphis is bigger than Boston, for example. None of us would think of it in that light. But we're the 20th largest city. We have about 600,000 people. About half of our population is white. About a quarter is black. About 15% at this point would be considered Latino or Hispanic. Those numbers have changed rather significantly over the last few years. And I did a little research in Barry Bluestone's text on how Boston changed over the course of the 90s. And if you haven't read a most scintillating economic study that really talks about how the city has changed around us in ways that most of us still are catching up with, I would commend that text to you. The racial and age demographics of the city today are profoundly different than they've ever been. We're experiencing a much higher level of immigration than we ever have. There are more young people in the city. Interestingly, racial and ethnic differences in the city in terms of mean family net income are now viewed as enormous, not just small, but enormous. Half of the people who live in Boston are homeowners as compared to a national average of about 70%. Only about 7% of white adults have not completed high school in Boston, as compared to 24% for African Americans and 58% for Latinos. There is a high degree still of racial segregation that structures everyday life in the city. 70% of the African Americans who live in Boston live in what would be considered black segregated neighborhoods. Only 1% of the whites who live in Boston live outside of what would be considered primarily white neighborhoods. Hispanics are the group that live in the most integrated neighborhoods in the city. Our black and Hispanic populations tend to be more poor than not. Blacks are twice as likely as Hispanics to be single heads of household. Black incomes are still less than 2/3 of comparable white household incomes. Hispanics are the youngest and fastest growing of all of the groups in the city, and they have the lowest per capita incomes. And a quarter of all Hispanic families receive some sort of aid for families with dependent children. Interestingly, as among African American and Latino families in Boston, fully 40% perceive themselves to live in communities that are involved at some level or another with drugs. There is negligible political clout on the part of either the black or Latino communities in Boston. Whites, interestingly, according to Bluestone, consistently rate themselves as more intelligent than African Americans or Latinos. Whites are older, and nearly all are born in the United States. 3/5 of whites who live in Boston have either not had children or are empty nesters, and whites have the highest household incomes of all of the groups living in Boston. So there's a fundamental economic disconnect between racial groups in the city. And that disconnect raises some very interesting and difficult questions for us around traditional models of assimilation and isolation in our communities. There's an interesting piece in the Chronicle of Higher Ed just a few weeks ago that talked about some of the academic models that are generally applied to determining whether folks view themselves as assimilationist or likely to be isolated within their communities. And the question that I would ask in relation to some of those studies is, do the emerging populations that we now know live in Boston view themselves as fully integrated into American or Boston's society, or are those emerging populations, which constitute nearly half of the people who live here, likely to become part of what would be viewed as an oppressed and marginalized social class within our city? Are we in or out? And that opens a series of questions around whether we believe that racial integration is desirable. Some of the more recent studies raise the question as to whether an assimilationist mode is not a way of being chauvinistic about our culture. We can ask whether the new groups, which are primarily ethnic minorities of color, will merge into Boston society in the same way that the Irish and Italian and Jewish immigrants merged into Boston society in the earlier period of migration here between 1870 and 1920. There's some work that was originally done back in the 40s and 50s that is the old traditional view of America as a melting pot. It's work that was done in 1945 by Gordon and Warner and those kinds of scholars who said that basically groups that come into this country are anxious to trend towards an adoption of Anglo-Saxon Protestant cultural modes and basically a kind of ethos that looks and feels like Boston. We're all pretty comfortable with that. In 30 years, I've certainly settled into that. And there was always a view that when immigrants arrived in this country, the tendency was to want to assimilate, to become part of the melting pot. That initial argument was then highly disputed in the 60s and 70s by folks who argued that, in fact, there was a reaction against that assimilationist mode. And that reaction was one that said, I want to shape my identity not within this culture, but in opposition to it. I want to know who I am not because I'm one of them, but because I'm not one of them. And scholars very quickly got into a set of arguments about what it meant, really, to be an American if one was an immigrant. And a lot of the change in the viewpoint on whether one would want to assimilate or not was driven by the very nature of the change of the immigrants who began to arrive, who are much more like the immigrants who are arriving today. Today's immigrants are much more likely, at least in terms of large numbers, are much more likely to be underemployed, much more likely to be people of color who stand out, much more likely to be illegal immigrants for whom assimilation is not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination, much more likely to be in a situation where they can go home quickly. It's a lot easier to get back to Puerto Rico or to get back to Italy today than it was 75 or 100 years ago. And so what that argues is that there's more of a tendency for immigrants arriving in Boston to see themselves as independent, semi-autonomous groupings within a larger society where the need and the desire to become assimilated not only may not be as great, but the desire to do so may not be as great. So what does that mean in terms of the way they see Boston and identify with Boston as a place to be? When we talked about those things that we think of when we think of Boston, we talked about universities, nonprofit hospitals, the Zakim Bridge, and a range of other historical elements, iconographic elements, that frankly, most of the new immigrants have had virtually no contact with unless they're employed working, for example, as janitors at Harvard or as orderlies at our hospitals. Most of them may not even be able to get jobs as guards at the Museum of Fine Arts, for example. We're talking about an identity for a group of half of the people who live in Boston that diverges rather significantly from the identity that virtually all of us in this room would say is how we identify with this city. And that could be troublesome. It'll be interesting to see, for example, tonight or tomorrow morning when the reports come out, who in Boston voted and who didn't. At my polling place at 7 o'clock this morning, I live in an integrated section of Jamaica Plain, I was the 14th voter at 8 o'clock. That was not a very good number. Not a very good number at all. And I suspect that when we look at the numbers of who has voted tomorrow morning, we'll see that participation in today's primary, as among this new immigrant group, will be negligible. We haven't engaged them in the civic life of this city in a way that enables them to feel that they are, in fact, a part of the city. So we have a troublesome aspect of the evolution of Boston, and that troublesome aspect is that almost half of the people who live here don't experience Boston in the same way we do. In fact, they're fundamentally disconnected from the way that we experience Boston, and their cultural identity within Boston is a fundamentally different cultural identity than the one most of us have. So what is it that establishes a sense of cultural identity in a place? It's obviously a series of things. It's experience. We love the bridge, but we haven't yet been over it. But once we've been over it, we're probably going to love it even more. We may or may not love the big dig. Once you've been through the tunnel, well, you may or may not love it more. But it's a combination of experience and a sense of place, shared language. It's about the education that we share among ourselves. I can be introduced here very easily, despite the fact that I used to joke that I went to a southern school in New Haven. Because I have all the right Yale credentials, and, you know, I'm part of it. I was a couple of years after John Kerry at St. Paul's, and, you know, I was in the same class as George Bush at Yale, and, you know, I'm one of the boys. But for half of the city of Boston, they're not one of the boys, and so their view, particularly as it's shaped by their educational backgrounds, is different than the view that many of us have. Cultural identity is shaped by status and history, as someone noted, by a set of traditions. In some respects, it's established strongly by the fact that a group may isolate itself from others in the midst of a larger grouping. Architecture shapes some of how we define our cultural identity. A room like this would probably not be found in the Southwest or in Southern California. To walk into this room is to know where you are in terms of place, but not just place, cultural identity. It's shaped by folklore and narratives. Many of us in this room have shared a whole bunch of experiences together around cultural things we've done and environmental things we've done and boards we've served on. I mean, we have been with each other, and so we share a narrative that shapes our cultural identity. It's shaped by memory. It's shaped by aspirations. It's shaped by artisanry, which we'll talk about in a moment. This thing, my guess is that in holding this up, at least 20% of you know where it came from. At least 20%, and probably more. And it's not from abroad. Can I have a guess on this? Okay. Right? It's an object, Charleston, South Carolina. It is an object associated with the Low Country between Charleston and Savannah. To look at it is to tell you a whole cultural history. So objects, in their own way, have a way of shaping cultural identity. And sometimes the objects are so powerful in terms of shaping cultural identity that we know exactly where they came from, we love them, and we associate with them immediately. In that regard, I'm going to do something that I love to do if I get the opportunity, which I don't very often, at one of these talks. Usually if I'm talking about stuff, I'm talking about it, in the South. You should know that my own dissertation took me into the Low Country. Why? Because it was warm in the middle of the winter and I needed someplace to do research where it was warm. And the research was on why it is anyone collects 19th century African American stuff. It was about trying to establish how African Americans and people who think about African Americans define 19th century African identity through the things they collect that we made. And in looking at that, I realized, well, in fact, there's stuff that is so well associated with particular places that, like that basket, when you see it, you know exactly where it's from, and it has a whole cultural history that ties in with it. So I've been invited back to, Savannah and Charleston a lot, and I talk to folks down there and working on a museum project, et cetera. And we talk about those kinds of things. But every so often, I get to talk about New England things. And whenever I do a talk like this, I like to treat myself by opening something that I've acquired for a collection that I haven't seen. Right? So what I can tell you is, we're all in for a surprise that relates very specifically to Boston, I hope. I hope I brought the right box. What makes this fun is that if this is what I think it is, I actually bought it 2 years ago. And people often say to me, why do you keep those boxes in your office and never open them? It's because it's fun to open things that have a kind of surprise element. Well, someone will clean up after. What? It's not glass. At least I don't think so. It's the joy of surprise around cultural identity that's sometimes the most fun. This is what I think it is. It's almost perfect for this talk. Looks like it. Maybe. Those of you who are curators are going to kill me about the way I'm opening this, but that's all right. It's mine. This object is a cultural identifier that everyone in this room will relate to, I think, because we're here at the Athenaeum. And it's in its own way an important cultural identifier. Whoever's taping this will love these sounds. Yeah. Oh, how nice. This is what? Yeah. Well, it's not a Revere, but it's a mid 18th century Boston-made can. It's got a little inscription on it. Picked it up at Christie's. It's a lovely thing, and anyone. Yeah, it's pretty nice, actually. And anyone from Boston has seen something like this. You know what this thing is, and you know what its meaning is. You think Johnny Tremaine, you think Paul Revere, you think independence, you think the Founding Fathers, you think everything that is good about the Revolution and Boston's history, right? It's all wrapped up in this little 1750, 1760 silver can. It's all here for us. This can has no meaning for half of the people who live in Boston. It's just a silver cup. So the question is, how do we go about establishing and connecting with a set of experiences and histories to those people who are more recently arrived in Boston in a way that connects them to us and to this history, but perhaps more importantly, connects us to them and to their history, because in fact, they are the folks who are going to be here 30, 40, 50 years from now, they and their children. And we and our children are going to have to figure out what this new city is going to be now that the city is in fact far more diverse than it's ever been. I'll talk about some of the other objects later, except that I do want to show one other thing. We know what this is. This is an important mid-18th century object. And I know the maker, and he's a Boston maker. Unless you're a tool guy, you don't know what this is. But I can tell you that this is a plane. It's used for basically filing down a shape. You see a shape along the edge there of that plane. You can look at these after. All of the beautiful 18th century furniture with its fancy molding and shaped edges, all of that was made with planes like this plane. A craftsman would take it and rub it along the wood and well, yeah, there are edges around here that are like this. The edges that you see up against the wall are typical of that. This was also made around 1750, and I have two of them, a round and a more fancy one. This is probably, from an historical point of view, a vastly more important object, albeit a utilitarian one, than this one. Why? Because it was made by a freed slave named Caesar Chalor, who lived in Wrentham. His master was the first plane maker in America. And when Chalor was freed around 1754, he then went into the business of making these kinds of molding planes. These planes were used on furniture that was produced throughout New England. And what makes them special is that, as was the case with all plane makers, he signed this plane. So this is probably, and we know that there are about 200 or 220 of these objects around, this is probably the earliest signed piece by an African American produced in the Americas, and it was produced right here in the greater Boston area in Wrentham. Equally rare, but obscure and unknown. These were the guys who did the work that made it possible for the people who could buy this to be who they were. Now, there's a disconnect between these two objects. This is a revered, as it were, object. This is something that most people would pass by. And so the question is, what is it that we can learn from artisanry that helps us to establish a level of cultural identity for the new arrivals in Boston? What is it that we can learn about the things they make that help to connect them to who we are as a city in 2004 that we would have otherwise overlooked? And how do we deal with that? Now, let me talk briefly about schools. What we were asked to do as a task force is to determine whether busing as we know it, which now costs the city of Boston $54 million a year, whether the policy and the implementation of a policy of busing could be modified in a way so that the city might be able to save $20 or $25 million to put it into a classroom. And the school department began to develop some plans around that. And then they realized, no, we can't really introduce these plans until we talk to the people that these plans are going to affect. And so Mayor Menino called me and he asked me to chair a group of about 14 of us who then started an initial phase of hearings, forums throughout the city to ask people, what do you think of the current school assignment process? And we got about 1,000 responses in this first set of meetings. And I want to share with you what it was that folks said. And what folks said, interestingly, defied a number of stereotypes. A lot of people went into these forums with an expectation that in the primarily white neighborhoods like West Roxbury, everyone would want neighborhood or walk-to schools. And that in the primarily black and Latino neighborhoods, everyone would want to continue some form of busing in order to maintain choice. But it didn't work out that way. It turns out that across the city, what everyone seems to want, first and foremost, is quality. They want the schools to be good. What they want is openness and access to schools that are of high quality. They want schools where siblings can go to school together. They want schools where about half to three-quarters of the students are from that neighborhood, but not everyone. It was very interesting to hear from for example, from Latino parents in Jamaica Plain who said, we have a great school here. We love it. We've taken charge of it. We run the principal. We get what we want in terms of quality. But we also do not want our kids to only be exposed in school to the same kids they play with. We want them to meet some kids from Chinatown in East Boston. So we want our school to be good enough that it will attract these other kids into our neighborhood. And most interestingly, as among immigrants and people of color who answered the question, what is it that you want most? The number one thing that came out was that they wanted to be respected when they walked into a school building because there were parents who cared about their kids. And the feeling was that without regard to objectively measured quality, that for most of them, walking into a school building was a demeaning experience where they encountered teachers and administrators who treated them as though they didn't really care about their kids as much as white parents did. They also wanted transparency and information availability. They wanted quality without regard to how far their children went. They wanted learning environments where the climate of learning was focused on teaching and learning, and where high expectations were held for their kids. They wanted schools where parents were heavily engaged with the schools. They wanted teachers who were supportive and experienced. This doesn't sound like rocket science. But in some respects, the answers that came from these immigrant parents in multiple languages, which are exactly the same answers we would have given if we'd been asked, the answers surprised the people who were asking the questions. Why? Because we think we're smarter, we think they don't care as much, we are the mainstream, they are the marginalized outliers, we are in, they are out, we care about our kids, they don't. Look at the way their kids are on the streets. And a whole set of misconceptions seem to have been driving a lot of our policies because we do not understand and recognize that what these different cultures want is the same thing we want. Now, how does that relate to objects? Part of what happens when you start to collect objects is that you realize that some are better than others. But you only learn what the word better means when you establish what in effect are hierarchies of quality. And those hierarchies of quality, more often than not, are based upon subjective rather than objective measures. This is not a better can than another one because it's lighter or heavier in and of itself. It's better because the form is better. That's subjective. And in the same way, what we're learning about the parents of new immigrants, the parents of kids who are now in the school system, and I need a parenthesis here, one of the other startling things we realized in these forums was that not only did the parents who are making choices for their children in the Boston Public Schools not live here when busing came into being, but indeed, most of them hadn't even been born yet. So their history of Boston as a city ripped apart by racial tension is totally non-existent. We might as well be talking to them about Lincoln freeing the slaves as to talk to them about busing and how it tore neighborhoods apart in 1975, because most of them hadn't even been born in 1975. And that in itself is a startling thing, because the tendency is to say, there's big history, you need to know the history, that's why we're doing this, that's why we're doing that. The reality is, we are living in a new city, and a city that is becoming increasingly dominated by populations that we don't even recognize the existence of. So, stuff. Discerning what is better about different kinds of stuff is about assessing quality based upon a set of subjective measures. Assessing what good schools are, it turns out, from our forums in communities, is not about MCAS scores and objective measures of whether reading or math scores are higher or lower than reading and math scores in a comparable school. It turns out that parents are looking at subjective qualities in schools when they make choices. Is the principal open to hearing from a minority parent? Does a teacher take the time necessary to have a conversation with a Somalian parent? And what we're learning as we begin to think about whether we can change the nature of the school assignment plan in Boston, what we're learning is that the factors we're going to have to use to help parents make better choices are almost entirely subjective factors, qualitative factors, the kinds of factors that go into helping us determine what is a good object, a better object, and a best object. It's how we feel about a thing as much as the objective measures and metrics that we apply to measuring objectively the quality of a thing. And that's where cultural organizations, such as this one and the museum, come in. Because it has occurred to us on the panel that while it is true that we're going to put forward several models for change, some of which will look like, well, maybe we'll just have one big district for the whole city and make every school open to choice. That's one end of the scale. And the other end of the scale is maybe we'll have more little districts, and then that'll sort of create neighborhoods. All right, that's another kind of model. But there may be a third model, or a fourth or a fifth, depending upon how many we develop, that looks not so much at how far away a school is from where someone lives. We may want to look at a model that in fact draws upon what Boston's great strengths and what Boston's identity is. That is to say, we may want to look at models that say, maybe we ought to affiliate a certain number of schools with our cultural institutions in this city. We used to do that with our corporations. Verizon, before it was Verizon, had a connection, and IBM and Fleet and Shawmut and all of the banks connected to individual schools, hospitals connected to individual schools. One of the models we're looking at quite seriously is one that says, forget about geographic zones. Maybe what you really need are zones of shared interest, zones of civic responsibility, zones that acknowledge that maybe some parents really want to send their kid to a school that focuses on the arts early, or focuses on craftsmanship early, or just focuses on reading Latin early. And that our cultural institutions, which are here, they're not moving, they are vested, they're in buildings with tax exemptions that are supported by all of us, that maybe there's a new role for our cultural organizations, our arts organizations to play in the city of Boston that transcends anything that we've ever done before, but that draws upon what Boston's core strength is, which is to say a not-for-profit, culturally based community with people like ourselves who care about these issues, who could perhaps be doing something to help improve the educational system in a way most of us haven't up to now. And so one of the models that we're looking at very fundamentally is one that says that the qualities that we use to determine the difference between, well, I won't show those walking sticks, but yeah, the qualities that we use to determine the subtlety and difference between this New Orleans walking stick, which we have reason to believe was used in various voodoo ceremonies. And this much more garish and somewhat obscene thing, I won't show the obscene side, walking stick, also from New Orleans in the 90s, produced by a carver who specialized in making what he called, and this is one of them, kill sticks, which were carried by pimps in New Orleans as part of their wardrobes. That the difference in subtlety and quality between this spiritual object and this object, which is basically an enforcement kind of object, our ability to discern even at a distance that there's a difference between these two is a quality that we can impart as cultural institutions to new immigrants in ways that help them also discern what the most important qualities are in this city as they choose schools. And that maybe the metrics that we use within the context of cultural organizations to subjectively measure quality are metrics that we need to begin to share with a wider community. So the challenge I leave you with is one that says that we, as people who have been, in our own ways, as privileged as we are, to be in this place, it's a great honor and privilege for all of us to be here and to share the camaraderie and the experiences, the memories, the traditions that we've shared here and outside, that we have to find out how we identify those new groups. And often we're going to do it through the stuff they make. It's often easier to do it through that than through random conversations. And to then bring them in ways that integrate them into, if not an assimilationist mode for this city, at least one that gives them a role to play and gives us a role to play in laying out a future for the city that is a much more diverse place than it's ever been, but I would submit to you a far more interesting and a much richer place than it's ever been as well. Thank you. Now, I did say I would open for some questions, and it can be on anything from South Carolina baskets to kill sticks to the schools, and let me just say in terms of the schools, within the next month or so, we're going to start to introduce some plans, some models. Then we're going to go out and do another series of 8 or 10 or 12 community forums, and I encourage everyone to show up for those and express your opinions at those forums, and then we'll produce a final plan which will go to the school committee, and that'll be voted on prior to the end of this school year. So there's an opportunity, if you have thoughts on the schools and the like to weigh in, there will be an opportunity. But anyway, there's a hand over here. Yes, ma'am.
What is going to be the impact, do you think, of the Catholic Church plan to close parishes and parishes?
Huge. We haven't yet seen any lists, and there may be some people who have inside information, but we don't yet. We understand that sometime within the next few weeks, we'll see something of a list that will probably disaggregate which parishes are closing and which schools are closing. The reason that the City Council, of course, is concerned, I have to say, from what I'm hearing, has less to do with a sudden influx of students into the Boston Public Schools than it does with the potential lost opportunity that will occur if a significant number of schools in key neighborhoods are closed and the Boston Public School system doesn't have enough lead time to try to capture some of those facilities to meet the needs of neighborhoods where we know there aren't enough buildings to make closer schools possible, whether you call them walk-to or neighborhood schools. The concern is that several schools in key neighborhoods could come on the market and basically be absorbed by either real estate developers or charter schools, and that the Boston Public Schools, which might be able to use those buildings to solve a problem, won't have enough time to respond to it. And that's why the request has been made to defer any school closings for a year so that the BPS can then do the budgeting and bonding and other kinds of things that would have to be done to make those schools available for public school kids. But the impact will be huge. There's an interesting figure that we also came upon in our early studies, and that was that from 1940 to today, the percentage of eligible Boston children, eligible for school enrollment, the percentage of eligible children who actually enrolled in the Boston Public Schools has remained essentially flat, constant. There was an assumption that busing changed a lot of stuff. It didn't. It meant that people who might have put their kids in one kind of parochial school put them in a community academy. But from 1940 to today, the percentage of eligible Boston public school kids who are either in private, parochial, charter, other kinds of schools, basically flat at about 15%. Now, there may be a bump in that when the diocese takes its next steps. But even there, it's not clear that those students are necessarily going to roll into the BPS as opposed to rolling into other kinds of school situations. Other questions or comments? Sir, in the back?
I'm trying to formulate this. There's a lot going on in my head. I'm really pleased to hear your response and your summary of the findings of the community needs, because I've been hearing some different things from the community. You know, and as you hold up the that had a very different meaning to David Walker than that one was made as well in 1828 or
1750s.
In that time, I'll use David Walker as an example from the early part of the 19th century. And we know that in Boston, from the 1840s on, African Americans have been struggling for equal education in the city. And so you speak in terms of new immigrants, but there's still the history within Boston. And then you describe the comments that the parents are making, and the comments that all parents would make. And that, from my experience in Boston and every other city in America, is the relationship between people of color and every major institution we have. So we can have the same discussion for healthcare. We can have the same.
Absolutely.
And so my question is, knowing that those institutions are all infused with white supremacy, how does this all play out? Because the same institutions in the arts, we know the funding institutions in the city, we know the situation of that. So how do you see this all playing out from that perspective?
There are some fundamental changes that have occurred in our communities of color. And it's part of the reason that we have to recognize the diversity of what now exists within the city. One of the things that Bluestone pointed out was that in the year 2000, it is about as likely, if one is African American, to have parents who came from Africa as to have parents who came from America. Now, that means there are a lot more Somalians, Nigerians, Senegalese, South Africans in Boston than we recognize the existence of. And so the mix of individuals in our communities is very different, our communities of color, is very different than it was even 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, to be Hispanic in Boston meant essentially that you were Puerto Rican. Not anymore. It means that you could be any of a range of things. Once one severs the preconceived notion that to be black in Boston either means that you're a black Brahmin or you're from Georgia or maybe Jamaica. Once one severs that preconception from the reality, then you understand that in fact you're dealing with a population that is not saddled with all of the same history and can therefore look at all of these issues in a rather different way than was the case before. I could give you some examples which I won't go into now. But what I'm saying is that there are opportunities for this new group of people to accomplish some things in the city that the prior group couldn't because they're not saddled with the history. You see, sometimes history is useful in terms of helping us know who we are, but sometimes it is also a box that prevents us from looking forward. And what we're discovering in these forums is that when we talk to people of color in the forums, the vast majority of them under the age of 30, who are the ones making the choices, are asking that we look forward. They have an interest in the history, but they really want to know what's going to happen to my kid now without regard to what happened under busing. Even the white power structure has changed in this town. It is, I'm constantly amazed at how much smaller it is than one would ever imagine. I mean, the fact that John Kerry and I were 3 years apart at St. Paul's and 2 years apart at Yale is not entirely coincidental in terms of his running and my standing here, right? It isn't. The fact that I moved to Boston and ended up working at a firm where Mike Dukakis was my boss and Bill Weld had the office across the hall, not coincidental when one really looks at the way the world works. A lot of us know each other in this room. But the issue is not so much one of a kind of monolithic power structure. The issue is what do we do with it? Because throughout the power structure, opportunities get created or made that create opportunities, for example, for the Athenaeum to do a partnership with the partnership. That didn't exist 20 years ago, but the partnership did. Certain things change, and when they do, we have to know how to take advantage of them. 20 years ago, I would not have been chair of the Board of Overseers at the Museum of Fine Arts. We have to understand how to seize the opportunities where they're presented, and also we have to understand how to mentor those who come behind us so that they'll be able to do the same and more. I mean, maybe that's an optimistic way of looking at things, but that's part of the reason I stayed here. Because this is a town that is, despite its flaws, it's a town that is full of optimism and opportunities. That's why a lot of us stayed here. One or two more? Sir?
30 years ago, when I first came to Boston, I worked with Massachusetts Finance Agency. And at that time, there was an Elliott Richardson, who was a very tall, distinguished African American. And he was the executive director of the Boston office of HUD. He worked on Columbia Point. He thought it was very ironical that part of his job was to make sure that there was open access and equal opportunity. He said, when I grew up here, I couldn't turn the corner and not go to a trash can. But my aunt wasn't calling my mother on the phone. By the time I got back to my house, I was able to go back down and pick up the trash. So he missed the cohesion in a neighborhood of family members. And the further irony, of course, was a year or two later, there was another Elliott Richardson who took himself out of the difficult situation, fired Mr. Cox, President Nixon, wanted that all coming up. So my point is, in spite of the fact that everyone should have equal opportunity with everyone, isn't there a neighborhood cohesion which will allow people with the same voice to feel stronger together to speak for their rights?
Part of what's been interesting about these forums is that it's clear that there are neighborhoods that either have or are building that kind of cohesion. And in a lot of neighborhoods, it's surprisingly diverse racially. Not as diverse in terms of class and in terms of economics, but certainly diverse racially. We went into a meeting on Dorchester Ave, and there was a parent with the most beautiful Irish brogue, that I've heard in ages. And he said, of course I want my kids to go to a diverse school. I want it to be as diverse as the kids they see on Dorchester Avenue. And then he rattled off all of the ethnic groups that now live on Dorchester Avenue. It's a very different time from when, Dapper made his comment about Dot Ave, about looking like Little Vietnam. And he said, here's an Irish guy, been in the neighborhood, been in the parish for a long time. He said, walk down Dorchester Avenue and look at the diversity of the kids who are here. That's who I want my my kid to go to school with. And I don't feel that she needs to be bused across town to experience the diversity that she sees on Dot Ave. And that's the case in JP, and it's the case in Brighton, and it's the case in a bunch of neighborhoods. It's not the case in some neighborhoods, to be sure. But in many of our neighborhoods, very quietly, I mean, people are surprised to go to D Street, you know, which got written up in the Globe a couple of days ago. People are surprised to go to D Street in Southie and see Latinos and blacks and Asians on D Street like, you know, they live there. Well, they do. So neighborhoods are actually becoming more cohesive in a lot of ways, even while they're diverse, at least in much of the city. Anyone who's been to Maverick Square recently, or anyone who hasn't been to Maverick Square in Eastie recently, is in for a shock in terms of the different dialects, Spanish dialects that you hear in Maverick Square. It's astonishing, right? Part of what we're trying to accomplish in looking at the school assignment business is to look at the way a school can now become, again, a community-wide resource. If a majority of the kids who live in the neighborhood don't get to go into that school because it's got a swimming pool or because it's got a decent track facility or a good librarian or computers that they can use after school, right, because they're on a bus, that raises a serious question as to how a neighborhood maintains a certain amount of internal cohesion. And it's not about going back to isolated neighborhoods. The demographics of the city are different today than they were a quarter century ago, and we need to build on that. Last question, there was a hand over there? Yeah.
How is the voucher system and the No Children, No Child Left Behind Act influenced this activity?
No Child Left Behind has created some profound confusion for a lot of us, in part because the key measures, the so-called average yearly progress measures, the AYP measures, are based upon a set of metrics, internal factors, that are so Byzantine that it makes it really difficult to tell what the real quality of a school is. For example, we found that test scores are broken out by ethnic groups, and not only by ethnic groups, but a school quality is also measured by attendance rates of individual ethnic groups in schools. So you could have a school with good reading and math scores, but if it turns out that the Latino population falls below a certain level in terms of its attendance records, that school will be considered an at-risk school or a school that is rated very low on the No Child Left Behind set of metrics. So a parent who looks at that can't really determine what the quality of the school is. And part of our goal in this process is to try to come up with some very simple algorithms or metrics that would permit a parent who doesn't know advanced math to figure out what a quality school is and what a quality school isn't. Right? There are some objective factors that we can look at, but I would continue to submit that most of the factors that we look at are subjective. When any of us have chosen schools for our kids, if we're choosing a private school for our kids, for example, and we visit 5 different schools, there are going to be some schools that you walk into and you're going to feel immediately, this is a place where I want my kid to be because I feel comfortable here. And there are going to be other places where you're just going to say, this is nuts. I would never send my kid to this place. If you subsequently found out that the test scores or even the college acceptance rates were higher at the school that you felt uncomfortable at, you still wouldn't send your kid to that school. And so part of what we're trying to do is to get at the subjective measures that help people determine what quality is. And places like this, because of who's here, and who's here, help us make that easier. So thank you very much.